In the previous clip, we have added the friend wrapper class. Now let's implement the iNotifyDataErrorInfo interface on that class. I press Ctrl- to add a using directive for System Component Model. I press Ctrl- again to implement the interface. Now let's scroll down to the bottom of the friend wrapper class, where we have the members of the iNotifyDataErrorInfo interface. The hasErrors property, the errors changed event, and the getErrors method. When you implement this interface, you need to think about how you can store the errors for a specific property name. What do you think is a good way? I think a dictionary is a good approach. So let's add here a private field to our class of type dictionary. I press Ctrl- to add a using directive for System Collections Generic. In this dictionary, we want to use the property name as a key, so I add here a string. Per property name, we want to store a list of errors. The errors in the friend organizer application will also be of type string. Let's call that field for our dictionary errors by property name. And let's initialize it with a new dictionary instance. Now we can already implement the hasErrors property. Here we just use our errors by property name dictionary and we call the any method. To get the any method, I need to add a using directive for system link. Now the hasErrors property returns true if there is an entry in the errors by property name dictionary. Let's continue with the getErrors method. Here we just check if our errors by property name dictionary contains a key with that property name, then we return the list that is stored under that key. Else, we just return null. So now this getErrors method is also done. Now let's add a helper method to raise the errors changed event. So here I add a private void method that I call onErrorsChanged. And as a parameter, I take the property name. Inside of the method, I grab the errors changed event, I use the null conditional operator to check if it's not null, and if it's not null, I invoke it for this instance with new dataErrorsChangedEvent args. And the dataErrorsChangedEvent args constructor takes also a property name. Luckily, we have defined it here already as a parameter, so let's just use this. Now we are done with the iNotifyDataErrorInfo implementation. But I want to add two more methods that simplify the way how we can add and remove errors. So let's add here a private void method that we call addError. And as a parameter, we take the property name and the error. Let's add another method that I call clearErrors. And here I just take the property name. Now let's implement these two methods. Let's start with the addError method. Here we receive an error that we need to store under that property name. So the first thing that we need to ensure is that our dictionary contains an entry for that property name. So let's check here. If our errors by property name dictionary does not contain a key for that property name, then we just create an entry for that property name by assigning a new list of string to that key. Now we can add the error to the list. But before we do this, we need to ensure that the error is not already part of that list. So let's check here. If the list that is stored under that property name key does not contain the error, then we just add the error to the list. So I just copy this and I call the add method on the list to add the error. As I have added now an error, I also raise the errors changed event by calling the onErrorsChanged method for that specific property name. Now we are done with the addError method. Now let's implement also the clearErrors method. Here we just check if our dictionary contains an entry for that property name. If that's the case, we remove that entry for this property. And we also raised the errors changed event by using our onErrorsChanged method. Now we are done with the implementation of the iNotifyDataErrorInfo interface on our friend wrapper class. We have also added these two helper methods, addError and clearErrors, that will make the work with errors very simple. Now let's add some validation logic. In the previous clip, We have implemented the iNotifyDataErrorInfo interface on the friendWrapper class. Now let's add some validation logic to the firstName property. Here in the setter, I just call a method that I name validateProperty, and I pass in the name of the firstName property. I press Ctrl- to generate that method. Let's name the parameter of the method propertyName. The first thing that we do in this method, we call the clearErrors method that we have implemented in the previous clip. We want to clear the errors for that property name. Now let's add a switch statement where we switch by the property name. This allows us to use that validateProperty method in different properties of our friend wrapper. Now let's just implement a case for the firstName property. As the world today is full of robots, I want to ensure that my friends are no robots. So I check here. If the firstName property is equal to robot, and I use here the string comparison enumeration, I use ordinal ignore case. I don't want this comparison to be case sensitive. And if the firstName is robot, I want to add an error, and I use the addError method that we have implemented in the previous clip. I pass in the property name and an error. Robots are not valid friends. Now let's run the application and let's see what happens. I select a friend and I change the firstName to robot. And you can see when the firstName is robot, the text box gets a red border around it. When I change it back to robot, the red border disappears. So you see, the validation that we have implemented works like expected. But actually, we don't see an error message in the user interface, and it might be even better if the whole text box turns red instead of just having a red border around it. So let me show you now how you can adjust the visual appearance of your user interface in case of an error. If a validation error occurs in the data binding, some attached properties are set on the target element of the data binding. In this case, the target element is the text box. In case of a validation error, the attached property ValidationHasError will be set to true on the text box. In addition, the attached property ValidationErrors will contain the validation errors that occurred. So you can use these two properties, for example, in a style of a text box to display the error in the tooltip. And this is what we will do now. In this demonstration, you will learn how to create and use a style for a text box, and you will display the error in the tooltip. Let's switch to Visual Studio. In the Friend Organizer application, I want that all the text boxes are displaying the validation error in a tooltip. So I want to define an application-wide style. I can do this in the AppSaml file of the UI project. Here you can see that we have application resources. These are resources that are available application-wide. And here we can define a style for the target type text box. This is an implicit style as we didn't set the xKey attribute on that style. That means it is implicitly applied to all the text boxes in our application. On the style you find a triggers property that allows you to define, for example, property triggers. With the property trigger, you can set something if a property has a specific value. In our case, we want to check if the ValidationHasError property has the value true. And if that's the case, we want to do something. We can, for example, define a setter to set the background property of our text box to the value red. Now if we have a validation error, the whole text box will turn red. Let's see this in action. I select a friend and I type in robot. Now you can see the whole text box turns red. But now we want to display in addition the error message in the tooltip. So here in the style we define another setter for the tooltip property of our text box. But how do we actually get the error? The error is stored in the attached property ValidationErrors that is set on the text box. So here we can create a binding and we say relative source self. Now we have the text box as a data source for our data binding. Now we can specify a path. We want to bind to the attached property ValidationErrors, which contains a collection of validation error objects. We just grab the first error at the index 0. But now what is this error actually? Let's open up the object browser from View Object Browser. Here we can search for validation. Now you see here the System Windows Controls validation class. And here we have the getErrors method that belongs to the attached property validation errors. You can see that it returns a collection of validation error objects. The validation error class is also visible here. You can see that it has an error content property that will contain the error. This property is of type object, because you can define your own error classes. But in case of the Friend Organizer application, the error content property will return a string. Because when you look at the Friend Wrapper class, you can see that its getErrors method returns a list of string. So our errors are just plain strings. That means, in other words, we can just use this error content property in our data binding. So I go back to the AppSaml file and I say here from that validation error, I want to grab the error content property. Now let's run the application again. Let's select a friend and let's type in robot. I hover over the text box and here I can see robots are not valid friends. Now let's see how we can display the error message in addition to the tooltip below the text box with a validation error template.